some more talk about talk. Or at least let us have some HDT, since that's popular now, high definition thinking. None of that cheap 50 lines or whatever they call it. We can beat that. High definition. Having to do with talk, and some of the things that I had generally in mind to talk about, brings up, at least from one person's opinion, the interesting question about anything. All right, I'll be more specific. The interesting question about such things as I was about to start off with, the primary and or the secondary uses of talk. I can, as I have before, say, all right, what I'm about to say, words don't actually cover it. But then I have threatened, or at least tried to hint to you that there's a threat lingering around, that something is wrong from one view, if there is anything going on in life that there are no words for. That if indeed, if I was serious about it, but let's say somebody else, if somebody said, listen, I have some sort of secret information, that the gods have talked to me, or I'm so brilliant, or something has happened, I've had some great moment of intellectual enlightenment, and I understand things now that everyone needs to know. But I'm going to tell you the truth, words are inadequate. There's no way I can tell you what I understand. That has been around as long as there have been words almost. About a week after people began to talk, somebody had a mystical experience. Some caveman came back and went, wow. He said, wow. Now I went, yeah. And he said, wow. And he said, man, I've been thinking, I don't know what the caveman said, man, but he said, I've been thinking about stuff, and I just understood something. And they said, well, what? And he said, well, I was going to try to tell you, but geez, words just won't cover it. That's an accepted fact. And as I have pointed out to you, I have even said that on numerous occasions. But then I have also said that that might be open to some further suspicion. Along those lines, a little bit further, I was going to start off in a certain way of talking about how talk is serving secondary purposes. And then to remind you of my definition, this thing, I didn't make up the words primary and secondary, obviously, but me talking about primary activities and secondary activities in the life of man, I made up the categories. I made up the way I define them. They are ad hoc. They're based on a premise, which I've also tried to, in the last 7 days, tried to make you highly suspicious, if not high-dimensionally thoughtful, about me suggesting anything with a premise might not amount to squat. There may not be anything special if it has a premise. So, the primary, for me to divide up activities into primary, which I pointed out for my ad hoc, for my definition by usage, would be those things absolutely necessary to minimally keep a person alive. That those would be primary. Then anything else would be secondary. And I could include, which I was about to for this first map, talk as secondary. But all secondary activities, you need to see in the continuing expansion of man, all secondary activities, my definition, nobody else's, I made up the division, but now I've got to show you that the division is faulty. That it's all spurious, which is ad hoc, gone into another county where the jurisdiction doesn't actually hold. That secondary activities are now necessary, or they wouldn't be here. Talk, you could look at as being a secondary activity. Now you've got to be able to look at maps in your own mind, that is your own high definition thinking, and look that, yeah, all right, here's what we're talking about, and be able to come up with another eye somewhere. It's going to take more than two, and be able to look over there and go, well, that's not true, but yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah, but that's not correct, that's not the end of it. But yeah, that's pertinent. Yeah, but it's not, no, that's not the end of it. Can you do that? Try. Secondary activities such as talk. A person, obviously people can be mute from birth and be functional human beings, be educated. People can be in comas and live for years. People can just have brain damage and not be in comas but lose the ability to speak. Speech, talk, I prefer to call it really right now. is necessary for human activity, but from the view of the division I'm making, it is secondary, except there is no such thing as secondary activity. If humans are doing it, it is not secondary. It is secondary. It is not an alternative. It is not something in column B that you can get or not pick out with the main entree. In general, humans must talk. A few people, as I pointed out, here and there can be injured, born in such a way that they do not talk. But humans in general, we're not talking about the mutants, we're not talking about the strays running off into the bulrushes and the local weed. Humanity, as the middle of the bell curve, has got to talk. And so, in that sense, it is a primary activity. The reason that I even drew up the map for you, that I sketched out the division between primary and secondary, is this, that there is a kind of gradual growing into the need to talk. And I say gradual, again, if you can do some high definition thinking, if we could pick out one time, 75,260 BC at 10:45 in the morning, the first human spoke. All right. Then about 1050, that went from being a secondary activity into being a primary activity. Do you follow? If you don't, then you went for several years and you didn't talk when you were a nipper. And you gained weight, began to motivate around, the motor, the limbic areas of your nervous system began to operate, and then one day, we could almost pick out the time, maybe your parents can remember that they looked at the clock and said on July 17th, it was at 3:32, you went, "Mama!" And so you could say it took you, whatever it was, 2 or 3 years, or with some of you it might have been 8 or 10 years for all I know. To call it a gradual process, do you understand, or do you begin to get a glimpse, for me to even have to use terms like gradual process, it really has nothing to do with the apparent linear time. Because 2 or 3 years is gradual and not gradual. 7,000 years is gradual and not gradual. 5 minutes, 7,000 years ago, from when the first caveman said a word, and then to 5 minutes later, it went from being a secondary activity, like they had been functioning, living, eating, procreating, up until the time that before they ever talked. And so everything they were doing was primary activities, right? And then they talked. And then 5 minutes later, I said, it had gradually gone from being then a secondary activity, like a hobby. The guy went, "Mama." Of course, for all I know, he could have went, "Mother." But another caveman went, "Hey!" And he said, "You can too." So they began to talk, and you could say it was secondary, because up until then they didn't need it. It was like a hobby. But gradually, like 5 minutes later, could have been 2 minutes later, or it could have been 7,000 years later. It's all gradually. It went from being a secondary activity there momentarily to being a primary activity. That's what all the growth of life is. That is part of how people are blinded. The ordinary intellect is blinded into believing that things are moving by fits and starts, or things are not moving by fits and starts, or things are taking 2 steps backwards for every 1 forward, or it's taking 3 forwards for every 2 backwards, or it's taking 1 sideways, or I don't know, and I'd prefer to skip right over the boardwalk. They do not understand that there is no such thing as gradual, there is no such thing as instantaneous, and if there were, then whatever happened gradually is still going on. It's not gone, and whatever happened instantaneously is still going on. To discuss anything, you surely have got a glimpse of this by now on your own, to discuss anything, for us, for me to stand here and do this, for you to, in life, for you or for any ordinary person to discuss anything, the verbal map has got to begin somewhere. It's just the way things are. The map has to have a beginning, and a beginning is always based upon a premise. I remind you of our working definition of a premise. It is a prior assumption upon which the succeeding argument or conclusion is based. So you cannot have a map that in some way, a thought, an idea, but you cannot have a verbal map discussing anything, attempting to detail anything, and suddenly it is thrown in your face and it make any sense. Not a lot of sense, not pertinent sense. If it had no premise, it would make no sense. No sense. If somebody had a verbal map and put it in front of your eyes, it was that kind of external sensual map, or if they could in fact whip it inside your brain and your nervous system, and there was this verbal map with no premise, they might as well have stuck a leaf in your brain. Or took a piece of bark and held it up in front of you. It would have the same meaning. Probably have more meaning. There has to be a premise in the 3D world. The discussion of me mapping out activities into primary and secondary, although they're ad hoc, they're conditional, they are relative, and they are definitely definition by usage. On top of all of that, they're based upon a premise. Any division, to say that people are good people and bad people, men and women, tall and short people, smart and dumb people, everything is based upon a premise if it is going to be mapped with ordinary intelligence. Part of why words seem to be deficient to many people, and why I spent some time trying to flog you people's brains and make you, in a sense, believe that I was indeed not flogging your brains, but whipping up on words' inability to convey certain information. And I have gradually, if you noticed, and suddenly for some of you in the last, several what? Minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, have tried to pull that kind of carpet out from under you, and for me to even go as far as to strongly suggest to you that talk in the 3D world may be the ultimate victor, that it may be the triumphant entry into man's 3D paradise intellectually. It may be it. It may be the red carpet, it may be the band, it may be the Arc de Triomphe, it may be the crowds, it may be the music, it may be talk itself. Maybe. The reason that words seem to be deficient, not just because I say so, not because some philosopher or some would-be mystic said so 3,000 years ago, but you have thought that. Everyone has thought that in their own way, that, words are not getting it. To zero in on part of the basis for this conclusion is that no comparisons, no metaphors then, are perfect. That is, no definition is perfect, because a definition is a comparison. And so anything that I could say, to go back to the example of me making up primary and secondary activities, for me to describe primary activities and say, well, that's pretty simple now. See, there's one stage of a premise. I can say, now, secondary activities are those things absolutely necessary for a human and for humanity to survive. They've got to eat, and they've got to digest food, and they've got to eliminate food, they have got to procreate to keep the race going, and you've got to just stay healthy enough to procreate in the next generation. And then I say, the rest, see, that's the premise. Then the conclusion coming up, or the argument is, all right, everything else is secondary, that's what I mean. And then I can say, but now wait, the division is not all that distinct. In fact, there is no such division. In fact, what I just described, words don't really convey what I'm trying to say, all right? It's because the comparison is lacking. That no metaphor, no comparison, no definition is perfect. And why might that be? Well, maybe I'll tell you. It's that every definition has got to start, every comparison, every metaphor has got to start, like a map does, somewhere. Therefore, they have to start with a premise. Therefore, any two things you're comparing, their definition did not start at their own beginning, because there was a premise, tacitly, a premise before everything. So to say that you're comparing primary to secondary activities, or you're comparing dogs to humans, or you're comparing ant societies to human civilization and saying, but the metaphor, the comparison is not perfect. Well, you're not saying anything. What you're saying is, without knowing it, that anything that you can say is based on a premise. That is, it doesn't start at its own beginning. That it's part of something that there's already been a premise. There's already been a prior statement. Whether you heard it or not, it's always there. You can't say anything without there being a prior statement of some kind. You can't say, well, let's compare dogs. And somebody says, well, what's a dog? And you say, well, all right. You know what a wolf is? Oh, yeah. Well, it's a domesticated wolf, sort of. That's enough. All right, so you got a premise. But you can't start where the dog is. You can't start where anything is. So then to say that the comparison, a metaphor, between any two things is imperfect is to say that which is secretly obvious. Because none of what you say, none of what you can define, none of what you can describe is starting at its own beginning. As I point out, that is one of the purposes of the intellectual concept of God. It's like, all right, let's get it over with. There's a premise. And there's this thing that is premise-less. And so let's get that out of the way and just assume that that's it, which is one reason that the idea of creation is a lot tidier than the idea of scientific evolution, with big bangs and all this mystery. You just get out of the way. All right, the original premise is God did it. There's a God somewhere. I don't know what he looks like. I don't know who he is. I don't know where he lives and all that. Maybe somebody says, I don't know, but by God, that's it. So then you can press on intellectually. But anything you say after that did not start at its own beginning. You are leaving out whatever you're talking about. Your toe, your dog, your mother, greed, beauty, taxes. Anything that you say is not starting at its own beginning, whatever that is. Whatever it is. I'm not here to tell you what it is, but whatever you're saying, you are not describing it from its own genesis, because there was a premise before it. So then to say that no comparison is perfect is to say nothing. You're saying that you have taken two things that you don't even have it back at its source to start with. So both of these things are already up and running in some direction before you conceive of it, before you speak of it. And so then to say that these two things that are running off on their own like two trains, not just in the 3D world, but like two trains running out into the cosmos in just diverse directions, and you're saying, wait a minute, I want to make a point here, but the comparison I'm going to make is not perfect. What you're trying to say is, I'm taking two things that are already out of my control. That is, I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, I know what I'm talking about, but only, at point, let's say that O is origin, just to draw it out, of course, two-dimensionally, that you can't ever start there, at the origin of something, of an idea. That you've got to start somewhere just past, even if it's tacit, even if you don't talk about it, it's the tacit premise of what you're talking about. And so then you're trying to compare two things on that nature, and you don't have either one of them from the beginning. So what you're talking about is already flawed. What you're describing, that's just the nature of everything. It's not the nature, it's not a flaw in you, it's not a shortcoming of humanity. That is the way the nervous system works. That is one of the purposes of language, is as part of the churning process. And so to say that these two things are not perfect, or to say, well, I've got an interesting metaphor. Let me compare to you some of the aspects, or a certain aspect of human activities in an ant colony. And the speaker gets all wound up, and some of it is so intriguing you never thought about it, and you begin to take notes. And somewhere in there, it seems like he's getting off, and he's about to trip over some of his own words, and he says, now, of course, the metaphorical use of an ant colony compared to human activity is not perfect. Nothing is a perfect metaphor. Nothing, and I don't mean to overdo metaphor, nothing is a perfect comparison. Nothing. Because you're not taking two things from some point of origin and trying to compare them. You're not even taking one from its point of origin and then another one that's already running and trying to some way parallel them verbally, intellectually. You're taking two things that are already going. You don't know where it came from. It's like two bullets have already been shot out of a gun, two guns somewhere in the universe, and you're trying to pull them together right quick, and they're going as fast as they can. And you're making some comparison which may have a point. It may sketch out some map to you or somebody else that may make them go, hey, But somewhere along there, for you to think or for you to say, well, now, wait a minute, the comparison between these two wild shots is not perfect, you're not saying anything. It can't be perfect. There cannot be a comparison that is acceptable, that is satisfying. Not unless you are way down on the intellectual evolutionary chain, to where you just don't care, you're serving another purpose. But to be a high definition thinker, to really be thinking, to really be using the nervous system at its highest level in regards to this, in regards to other things, you need to see, because you keep wanting to find, and that's part of my job, it's part of what I'm doing here besides entertainment, is trying to find how things seem to fit together, which is a form of comparison. It's a form of definition. It is all a metaphor. But they constantly seem to be squirming away from each other, or it seems to almost fit. That, wait a minute, I almost believe I'm about to reach some great intellectual Buddhahood just looking at an ant colony and the things I was sitting there thinking about human civilization, and geez, it got to one point and the whole thing just fell apart. You didn't miss anything. Well, you missed something. You missed understanding that it's all going to fall apart, because there is no perfect comparison. There is no fully satisfying metaphor for anything, unless you were talking about two things and you could conceive of them prior to the premise. Man himself, we can speak of the intellect of man because you would not be serving the purpose, humanity would not. So man slash the intellect have got to have a premise to get cranked up. To just get started, they had to have it 7,000 years ago, if we're going by my phony baloney historical retelling of the cavemen beginning to talk. They had to have it then. You had to have it at the age of whatever you were, 18 months when you started to talk. You have to have it continually every day. That to get the intellect cranked, for humanity to get going, there has to be a premise. It is like the starter on a car. The matter of the premise is that what each person thinks is their premise. That is what cranks them up. We're back to something I mentioned last time we were taping. I'm not inclined to get into it tonight. It has to do with, I guess I'll call it, coeval causality. Because I already said that you got to have a premise to get cranked up, and now I just said that what people think, that is, you got to have a premise to start thinking. And then I said that what people think is their premise. So any of you who are following this with a linear mind, you just jump the track. Or of course, if you're real hostile, you think I just jumped the track. But tut-tut on you. What people think is their premise. Now what people do is another slightly different story. Of course, I'll be truthful with you, it's the same story. But I'm talking about one thing tonight. Which, of course, you're ordinary, you'd think, well, that means the stuff you're not talking about is not pertinent. God, I'm glad you people are not ordinary, because I don't have to deal with that kind of stuff, do I? Other than stop for just a second and point out that I don't have to deal with it. I think in the halls of psychology that's known as positive reinforcement. In some quarters it's known as wishful thinking. But at the very least it's known as efficiency. I just go right ahead as though you're not going to stop and become captured. What people think and what people do, but I'm specifically talking about thinking, and we're still talking about talking, remember, is each person's premise. Think about it. What is it that cranks you up? It's you thinking. Now at a primary level, we can say that you get cranked up every day at the very least, that if you just laid in bed, didn't have a job, or decided the hell with my job, all that secondary, you would finally get up because of primary reasons. Assuming you were fairly a neat person, you'd get up to get out of bed to go to the bathroom. But at the very least, you'd finally have to get up, I guess, to go eat. And so we could say that real primary things would finally get you cranked in the morning, right? But you would not be a full functioning human. What gets you cranked is what you think. And what you think is your premise. That is your life. Now, not some old idea that, although I again point out it is a kind of crude reflection, but this kind of old idea that people are what they think. And I'm sure that some psychologist or some huckster with a book said that last week. But also, those of you who remember, there were some fairly well-known Greeks 2,500 years ago that said it. In case you won't tell the hucksters or ask them how come they're not sending royalties over so they can find the family and the estate. It's not simply a man is what he thinks. I didn't say that. If what everybody says out in life was true, remember I'd say, well, the only thing I had to say was what you already know tonight. I was going to say that a man is what he thinks, but then I realized everybody knows that, so I guess we'll meet again Friday and I'll see if I can come up with something original. No, I'm thinking something else. What a person thinks is their premise. Well, somebody thought about it a little more. Well, at least let me point this out. I want to assure everybody there are enough premises to go around. I want to be sure that everybody understands that. Life has continually provided absolutely adequate, and I could even say some surplus, but I'm going to tell you it's absolutely adequate that there are premises just galore. There are enough to go around. I hate to brag on me, but again, I got to point out that can I note the obvious or not? That is, does not everyone have a premise? Well, does not everyone that you know think? Don't get into some qualitative judgment of your fellow man. Do they not think? They talk, so they think. They have a premise. They consider themselves individuals. Everybody considers themselves in some way worthy or unworthy, which is the same thing. They have a premise. They are alive and they are thinking. They are talking. I wonder why would I bother to say that there are enough premises to go around? Did I just say that? Did I just open my mouth? Does my tongue and lips just run? Well, let's don't get personal. The point was, there is a purpose in me pointing that out. I was hoping I could do it and then turn my head in the subject and some of you really get something out of it. But evidently, wishing and hoping again. By me saying that there's enough premises to go around, see, what was the premise of me saying that? Well, the premise was that people don't believe that. Of course, then I got to do even more prior premising, because nobody's ever thought about it before. I'm the first person that ever said it. But for me to say that there are enough premises to go around, the tacit premise of that statement was that some people fear there are not enough premises to go around. Now, they never called it that, but here's the way the song goes. Differing inferior opinions from me. That's it. Well, look at all the dunderheads in the world. Look at all the slow starters up here. Look at all the people with distorted views. Look at them. Now, throughout history, you know, we're surrounded by peckerheads and Philistines, right? What you're saying is, the man who says that is, by God, there are not enough premises to go around. We got people clutching at straw premises. We got people grasping at premises that they don't even qualify as premises. Did you hear this guy, what he said he thought? He believed that some old man with a beard that lives up in a place covered in black velvet, that he went boom and created everything, and now there are people out there wanting to pull children out of school and burn books because of science. Can you believe that? What they're saying is those people are short of premise. Right? All criticism, one person to another, of course, being the necessary transfer of energy, always that. But the way it appears on the verbal level is this, that all, I'm saying it appears by the way I'm trying to get you to look, that all criticism is saying, well, my God, we're short premises around here. Because these poor folks, or that one guy didn't get a premise. And he's come up with some kind of homemade premise. Or he's just picked up some scraps of 2 or 3 premises that he heard here and there, and he kind of stuck them together, and he's come up with this wild idea that communists and people from Albania are the ones trying to get us to teach, and the communists are trying to get us to teach Darwinism in our schools to pollute our children's minds. That and there's some kind of banking conspiracy tied into it too. All right. A man would say, without knowing it, that whoever is fostering this didn't get a full premise. That we got a shortage of premises. That, now you know what I'm going to tell you, that is a premise. That's a life. You may not want to be locked up in a steamer trunk with a man for a 2-week voyage, but that man is alive. He is cranked up and he is serving some purpose, and he has a premise. I put it to you some months back that a lot of you liked for several weeks, and your eyes kind of rolled around, and of course then it, as all things do, it sort of went the way of all flesh. I don't know Steinbeck any royalties for that, do I, or whoever wrote it. And that was, I told you that the world is big enough for everybody. And the first night I said that, a bunch of you went, ooh, and you should have. To see that. You know, I went into even, I even took the metaphor down to a physical level to point out to you, if there were people whose premises in life, I wasn't using those terms then, but if there are people that you just abhor, even everybody, let's say, the world's big enough. There's land that I know hadn't changed that much. It's real cheap, not only in Montana and Idaho, but in Arkansas and Mississippi, to where I'm sure you could save up a little bit and buy yourself 10, 20, 50 acres. If you get in the right spot, you don't even need a lot, and plop yourself down, and nobody's going to come looking for you. I mean, you can leave notes and say, to hell with all you people, I'm going off by myself. The world ain't big enough for all of us. Try and find me. I still won't come back. You can try and drag me back and I won't come back. I ain't going to try to drag you back. The world's big enough for everybody, including that stuff. There are enough premises to go around. And people are unknowingly operating on the assumption that there are not enough premises to go around. That you are surrounded. I'm kind of pushing it, but there's a quite large number of people in the world and in backward history who are not fully cranked up, who we would have been better off without. You're saying that they did not have a premise. You're wrong. There are enough premises to go around. From a certain view, this is a subparagraph. Those of you that like to know we have changed gears here. A high definition truck, that's HDT, remember, same thing as high definition thinking, has more than your car is, that is 4 or maybe even 5 gears counting overdrive. A high definition truck, the kind I have in mind, even with 18 wheels, has at least a like number of gears. So I'm still talking about premises. But I've shifted a slight gear here for those of you that would like to feel like that your brain shifted a little bit, and so that some of you didn't think that you got lost. Of course, if you don't shift along, you will kind of be lost. But here it goes. From a certain view, old world existence, ordinary existence, could be seen as men seeking a premise for their life. Now, I've already pointed out to you that if you're alive and cranked up and thinking, that is your premise. What you think is your premise. And yet, you can see that which seems to motivate, carry along people in these few years on this planet, although they don't use the terms, obviously. You could be seen as people seeking a premise for their life. Now, it's not that hard to see. Ordinary people talk about what's the meaning of life. I'm sick of living. I even contemplate suicide sometimes. I don't know. I would just drink myself to death or into a stupor. I wish I had a better reason to live. They're talking about a kind of apparent seeking of a premise. And yet the premise is already extant. Nothing's at fault. Life is still operating very efficiently. But they believe they're seeking a premise. The most common one being looking to religion. It always has been. Like, all right, we're here for a reason. People religious, or people with just a slight philosophical turn of mind, or people with the blues may say, geez, we got to be here for a reason. If we just knew what it was, I'm sure I'd be happier. They believe they're standing like at my point here of point O of origin, but somewhere down what appears to be the linear line of time, and they're saying there must be a reason for life. And so they're believing that there is a linear flow of time, and they're trying to see past where they are now intellectually, not physically. They're trying to see, or at least they're talking about, there's got to be a premise for this. And they believe that they're looking in backwards history. That is, what is the assumption, the prior assumption, that has got to be accepted, got to be understood for this currently, this current argument, or this conclusion. If I indeed am some kind of conclusion, I may just be an argument, but for me to be here, there had to be some prior assumption. That is, the meaning of life. If I just knew that. So they believe, if they were using my kind of ad hoc maps of the night, that yes, I am short of a premise. That is the premise. They're talking, aren't they? They're thinking. They're alive. They may be hollering, I wish I wasn't alive. Okay. Doesn't cost them more to say that. If I get any madder, I may kill myself or at least go off and move to Idaho, whichever is worse. If I can't find my premise. Okay. Because that is the premise. They're up and running. A slight shift of gears. Again. People are what they say. Come on. Some HDT. Come on. People are what they say. That's not a metaphor. That's not a retelling of a man is what he thinks. I am not Norman Vincent Peale, even if I had his appeal. People are what they say. All right, I'll give you a sub one to that. People are what they say they are. But that is a premise that ordinary intelligence cannot grasp. Cannot. Because you cannot tell ordinary intelligence, you are what you say you are. Well, that's not true, because what I am right now is dissatisfied. I am not complete. I have not reached the fullness of my intellectual years. I have not come to full personal fruition. Okay? So I am not what I say I am, because I am still in the process of becoming. Okay? I am still looking. If not for the original premise, I'm at least looking for my premise. I'm looking for my reason for being here. So it's not true to say that I am what I say I am, because what I say I am is I'm not yet completed. Okay? At one time, I even wrote under different circumstances, some of you I know read, that I was pointing out that language served two basic purposes. factual, as I call it then, and social. And what I've tried to do now is, over this span of apparent time, is get you to see that that has much further ramifications that can begin to go into the never land of what's right beyond the premise, because ordinary talk cannot go there. But let me see if I can hint and sketch a bit more. You can easily, for a temporary, just for a few minutes, you should be able to see that I can reasonably split up language into the factual and to the social. To say that in one of those two categories fits everything that anybody ever says. The factual would be, it's 5 o'clock, honey, you should better go to work. Or for you to say, sir, do you know what time it is? And the guy says, almost 5. Or for you to ask someone, can you tell me how to set the spark in my car? And the guy says, all right, and he tells you. And it seems to be nothing but factual language. That the only thing that is transpiring between you two is the relaying of factual information, directions. And that the other category I named would take in everything else. That which is not directly instructional, that which is not based on fact, it just seems to be social, just blabbering. And I don't mean in a pejorative sense, but just people just chit-chatting, just talking about nothing in particular, all the way from gossip to just friendly, a kind of grooming of each other verbally. But instead of picking off fleas, you're kind of picking off neural lint off each other. We got to turn the tape over. Is there any more hot? Could I have them? Give me another half cup if there's any hot. You could see, in a certain way, what I'm describing or have described as being the division of factual and social. You could see that also, he said, wishing and hopping, as being not completely disconnected from the realms of primary and secondary activity. Right? Because I could draw out this scenario for you verbally and say, here's our old hoary cavemen. And their first thing that they would be talking about would have to be factual. The pointing out of food, where I caught some food, where did you get that food, where did you find those berries? Yeah. Go down that way about 2 kilometers. What the hell's a kilometer? All right, miles. They would have to be factual. The guy says, what is that? And he says, fire. And he says, well, how do you get some? And he tells him. All right, you would think, would you not? Does that not sound reasonable? That factual language, factual conversation should be somewhere comparable to my primary activity. Right? Wouldn't that seem right in a linear world? And then social. That once they got past some factual, whether it took 5 minutes or 500 years, all the same, the guy says, where'd you get those berries? And the guy says, go down there about, all right, 2.5 miles. So the guy goes in there and he eats and he feeds his family. He comes back and he says, hey, that was great. I appreciate you telling me. This talk is a good thing. I would have never found that. I've never been that way. So then he sits down and he says, by the way, what's your name? And they talk and he says, you've been around here long? All right, then you could see that once they have taken care of the absolutely primary needs, and it's kind of handmaiden of parallel secondary talk, primary talk of the factual information, that then they could get into what might appear to be secondary activities and then begin to engage themselves and one another in social conversation. That which they can talk about are you from around here? Oh, is that your wife I see hanging out of the cave? That you could say, well, that is not absolutely necessary conversation. It's just kind of social, right? If I may turn you back to, how long were these tapes? 45 minutes ago. Where I started, there is no perfect comparison, there is no perfect metaphor, and one thing does not cause another. And there is no such thing as factual talk cut off from social talk. And there is no such thing as primary activities or primary needs cut off from secondary needs. There are obviously primary needs, whether I ever told you that or not, or whether I ever put that name on it, or whether you ever heard anybody put the name on it. But for me to say that there's secondary needs is in a sense a five-dimensional canard of the first order, whatever all that meant. Because there is no such thing as secondary needs. If it is spoken of, it is a primary need, or nobody would ever spoken of it. But to try and to see, because all maps, anything that you're going to try to explore, you got to start somewhere. What does that real tacky, so I heard, court of Isabel and Ferdinand, what did that have to do with Columbus stepping out onto the shores, the Canary Islands, and thinking, boy, now here's a place to put in some offshore money and they won't find it, or whatever he thought. What beautiful beaches. Not bitches, beaches. What did that have to do with what had already taken place? What did it have to do with how smelly Queen Isabella was? That she never took a bath and she had roaches in her hair. But, and what did it have to do that he knew his way around Madrid or wherever he came from? What did that have to do with where he is now? Nothing? Yes. Everything? Yes. You could not have had one without the other. It is not as simple as saying that there is one kind of conversation that serves one need and then there is a distinct jump somewhere else. So while remembering that, we'll press on as though I didn't say that. What would appear to be secondary needs for human conversation? Social. Could I try and point out to you that life absolutely had to have men talking about things beyond that which would fit into my category of primary factual information? How do you make that stuff fire? Where did you find those berries? How did you get this thing to stand up to keep the rain? What angle did you run these things? What did you put on top of this? Beyond that, the time came, whether it took several thousand years or 2 hours, that the immediate needs of staying alive were done with for the time being, and the necessary talk that went along. And so there they were. Not just being socially uncomfortable of sitting there and how people are in an elevator or in a waiting room, not that. Life being efficient and life needing energy to keep moving, and right then there was no other reason for these 2 or 10 cavemen, they're all sitting around, and there's no other pressing need. There's nothing that any of them needs to know immediately that they need to pass factual information to take care of primary needs. They just got through eating, everybody's got laid for the night, and they're just sitting around, the fire's going, they're warm. If people are going to talk, that is, if that kind of energy is going to continue to flow into life through life's nervous system, in a way life had to encourage people to be inclined to talk. And being the old prankster that life is, how did life do that? Now, I hinted for the last 2 nights and sort of hit it on the run, but now I will tell you outright, although I must point out the words are not adequate to cover. Well, never mind now. Life had to give words, talk, something more than, although it was necessary, and still necessary, still useful, none of us could live without it in this life, beyond the cold, impassionate relaying of information, factual conversation. If that was all that was needed, that's all we would do, and there'd be very little talk going on. All right, there would not be as much talk going on. Would you grant us that? All right. So how did life encourage people to pass on this energy by talking when there was no immediate need to keep the primary hungers and necessities satiated? In its devilish way, life did this. Just as at the nonverbal level, any behavior of any consequence, any behavior has a payoff. It has a reward. Eat the right food, you live a while longer. You may even enjoy the food. Eat the wrong food and you get sick. You can suffer pain or you can be pleased by primary activities. Sex. Trying to find a place out of the rain and you come into a nice warm cave, or you go into a cave that's all musty and the cave itself is damp. All nonverbal activities have, if they're of any consequence, have a payoff of some kind. Everybody understands that. But life has done other things. Let's stay with the nonverbal for a minute, while remembering there is no such thing as, this is all artificial to say that there is a nonverbal separate possible life for humans down to the nervous system below the cortical level. But in the magic of words, if not TV, I can do it. So we'll talk for another second as though we're talking about a human who is a human still, but without we're just talking about the area below the talking part, the cortical part. What has life done? Now, down the areas that would seem to be absolutely primary, by my definition, food. Life has made food pleasurable to such a degree that people eat even when they're not hungry. Do you follow? That it is not just hunger, that is, it is not just primary needs that are necessarily being fed at any given moment when you or anyone else is eating. That doesn't mean that you're a glutton. But it means in general there would be no such hobbies, no such secondary in life, in food, in life as gourmeting. There'd be no restaurants probably. There'd be no cookbooks. There'd be no shows on PBS of cooking. Food would not be a hobby. Probably the best example that everyone I'm sure has already thought about is sex. That we got to have sex to keep the race going. So it's, at times you just know that you got to do it, or you're going to go nuts. You just don't. You don't have to think. If you didn't have a mind, you'd still be doing it. A dog, beavers, do not have a cortical intellect, and as I assume as you know, I don't want to upset anybody, but they do it. As Cole Porter said, even little clams, everybody does it. Even the Cabots and the Lodges do it. Everybody does it. But look what life has done. On top of that, it made sex, in a sense, gave it like icing on a cake or a second story. It turned it into a kind of secondary activity. That is, that sex is fun. It's hard to even compare. It's easy to say this is not anything much more fun than screwing. Not necessarily to make babies. By no means. Now, back to talk. Now let's consider the full human being with the intellect working. Not only is talk, can you compare it right quick? Remembering there is no such thing as a perfect comparison. Could you compare right quick talk to sex? That sex serves a purpose? That a lot of people have got to do it, including your parents, you knew that. They got to do it whether they enjoyed it or not. They got to do it to keep the race going, right? But for a whole lot of people, life made sex fun. So much fun that people do it and then get pregnant just by accident. Which you could say, thank God for accidents. I'd probably be addressing an almost deserted room, assuming I would be here. So life has turned this from an ad hoc view, right quick, an ad hoc map, from an absolutely primary, inescapable, factual necessity of sex for procreation into sex for fun, so that people continue to engage in sex when they got no interest in furthering the race and fathering children. Just people do it, and it's like almost a slash off that enough people to get pregnant. Almost. Now think about talk. that people have to talk, and now look at talk as being comparable to sex at the procreational level, that people have to talk on a factual level, or humanity would not be what it is. Humanity would not be evolved, even in the 3D sense where it is, which life needs life. Humans evolved to that point. But beyond that, it did something else, and it did it comparably. It made talk, comparably speaking, into a kind of recreational sex. But to do so, there has to be a feeling of payoff. And what is the payoff? Quite simple. That once you get past the absolute minimal factual conversation of, sir, do you know what time it is? 4:30. That by itself seems to be cold-blooded objective. Of course, it's not really, because you had some reason for asking. But beyond that, when we get into what I have erstwhile referred to as social conversation, secondary conversation, there has to be the appearance, there has to be the sensation that talk itself is sensational. In the first definition of sensational, I say that. That is, it has a sensation to it. It is sentimental. That talk itself is not at the secondary level, in the social sense. That life is no longer, I can't believe I'm going to do it again, sang-froid. It is not cold-blooded. It is not, it's 4:15. Talk past that level, social talk, secondary talk, now, to each person, holds the promise that talk is either going to give me pleasure or make me suffer. From last time, remember. Let's look at social conversation, back to my caveman example from last time we were taping. Two guys are sitting around, it's just been shortly after they learned to talk. 2 hours or 2 million years. And both of them are already, they're well fed for the night. But they're sitting there, and one guy looks down at the other guy's feet, and he sees some berries and stuff, and he says, I've never seen berries like that. Where'd you get them? And the guy says, well, it's down that way. And the guy says, well, that's good to know, because next time I'm hungry, I'll go down there and look. Are they good? And the guy says, yeah. It was not at that moment apparently serving a primary need, because the caveman who asked about these scraps didn't get up and go, but it was pleasurable to know where these are. Or, the example I used, they're sitting there, and let's assume that they're both been laid for the night, and one of them says, do you know that that woman you're living with is fooling around with half the guys in the caves around here? All right, right at that moment, let's say that the guy who's hearing this did not need, at a primary level, life was not making him right then to say, look, I'm enjoy talking to you, but boy, I got to go do it. And I'm so horny I'm about to break out in firecrackers. He wasn't. He wasn't even thinking about sex, let's say. And this other guy brings up sex at a verbal level, and what he says to the second guy makes him suffer. That right then he did not have an interest in going and having sex with his woman, but now he is upset because he didn't want anybody else to. The words, understand, not sex, the words made him suffer. The first part of my example. The guy didn't go eat the berries. He wasn't hungry then. The pleasure was not in eating the berries. The pleasure was in this guy telling him where they are and assuring him that they are primo. That is some good berries. The joy, the pleasure, the payoff in the words is almost secondary. It's almost non-factual. It is almost ephemeral in the sense that right then behavior is not executed. There was not some material occurrence happen that gave pleasure or pain. He didn't go eat the berries right then and enjoy it. But when the guy said, boy, these berries, you've never seen these? And the guy said, no. He said, they are good. You want to try some? Well, I got one left. He said, well, no, I'm full. He said, but you're that good? And the other guy says, they are some of the best I've ever eaten. And what's funny is they're just around, if you go down that little path and you turn past that big tree, and I just never looked. And the guy said, well, I hadn't either. But he's sitting there, he smiles. You've been through this. Or somebody say, have you tasted that new yogurt they've got at such and such? And you're not in the mood for it. And you say, no. Is it that good? Yeah. You enjoyed the words. You didn't go eat the yogurt. The guy didn't go get the berries. But he got pleasure from it. There was a payoff from apparently almost just social babble. And conversely, the guy got hurt. Another man says, I don't know why I should tell you this, but did you know that your wife is fooling around when you're out looking for berries? He did not walk in and find his woman with another guy. He did not walk in and find him there, another guy jump up and hit him with a rock. They're sitting there, and he wasn't thinking about sex, and this other guy says, do you know about your woman? The words gave him non-pleasure. There was a payoff to the words. It was not simply babble. The words were sensational. Life required that men talk. Life required that men talk more than I am describing, not incorrectly at that, but what I'm describing as the bare minimal operations of factual transmission of information. Just cold facts, that which is necessary to live, either in caveman times or today. Which today, I'll grant you, it may take more factual conversation to get you up to speed in your job, to get you promoted in your job, to learn how to drive, to learn how to obey the rules of the road and all of that, and everything else. There may be more, but so what? That's not the point. But beyond that, there would not be enough talk, that is, that kind of transfer of energy, if life had not made talk itself hold out the promise of a payoff. That words themselves are not cold-blooded. Words are not simply factual. Words are not simply the conveying of information. It can be that. Certainly can. But talk is also sensational. Talk continually. If you're past the factual, which we all recognize as factual because most people find it pretty boring. Well, other than the fact that you want the information for some reason, to get your car fixed, or you're trying to put something together, or you do want a promotion. But beyond that, what's more fun? What do people read in the bathroom or at home for fun? Do they read computer manuals? Do they read how to do heart surgery on yourself? Or do they read People magazine or the National Enquirer? They read words that are sentimental. In the real sense of sentimental, that doesn't mean Elizabeth Barrett Browning sob stories. That is, that the words seem to cause feeling. Talk is sensational, beyond the factual level. Do you not see why I was saying life, the old prankster again? Talk has a kind of parallel payoff that sex does beyond the procreational primary level, that food does beyond the primary necessary level to sustain life. Shelter. When people get money nowadays, at least in the Western world, where does it begin to go? They get a little excess money. It's more and more they play with the house, a bigger and bigger house. When the primary need is to get out of the elements, to stay alive, right? If I got all this money, bigger house, bigger than my neighbors, bigger than my mother ever had, bigger than my father could ever afford. A house that makes people go, ooh, I could just die that he's got a house like that. It is now a kind of secondary activity, and it has sensation to it. If it's cold and it's rainy and you're out there stuck in the elements, what kind of real sensation, now think about it a second, it's not this hard to see, is there to get in out of the rain? You're pleased in the same way that you're pleased to engage in sex when you're horny, to eat when you're starving. But to get in out of the rain, just to get in a tree or in a cave, no, it's not a big deal. Not in the sense that I'm trying to get you to compare it, as faulty as the comparison may be. There's not the same sensation that the guy who has gone in debt for $2 million, and finally the contractor and the interior designers and everybody says it's ready, and he drives out and he brings along his family and some of his inferiors at work, and he looks at this thing, and he looks at it and he thinks it's mine, and he walks in. Maybe it's raining, shrinking a little, but when he walks in, that feeling, $2 million. God almighty. That's not the same as stepping under a tree to get out of the rain. It's not good or bad, but it is not the same, and it is on a direct parallel, if you know that two bullets going in different directions can be, once you get past the need for a premise. This is the same thing as social talk. This is how life has made men be inclined to talk more, to turn up energy. Furthermore, this is a sub-paragraph that is a supra-paragraph. Life specifically needs men to talk about themselves. And they, if I may understate it, would not be so inclined were it not for the fact, again, that life has made talk be sensational. That is, why would a man talk about himself, pro or con, if he did not have a sentiment about it? It doesn't matter whether a man says, yeah, I'll tell you the kind of guy I am. And he comes on like a man with 22 gold chains around his neck, and a man who seems to be pleased with himself in the 3D world, which is fine. Yeah, I'm the guy that owns that new $2 million mansion up on the hill. That, or a man who says, my parents just should have named me Medre. They should shoot me. I'm terrible. I'd commit suicide if I could afford bullets. It doesn't matter, but do you see that people would not talk about themselves? The first, remember the premise of this paragraph, was that life not only needs men to talk more than just at the, what you could say is a primary and necessary level to convey factual information to keep life going through man, but to make man talk socially. That is, on what would almost appear to be, ad hocly speaking, a secondary level. But what really keeps it going is this, that I was trying to narrow in for you to get you to, don't forget the third one up here, that life needs men specifically to talk about themselves. Those of you who are getting good at seeing the obvious in the world of 5D could say, well, now that you mention it, when it gets past that little area of actual factual information, what else are men talking about? A man can apparently be talking about his house. That $2 million mansion, I heard you people talking about that over there. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I heard you talking about that new house. Of course, he's talking as fast as his eyelids will go, and somebody says, is that yours? When you get past the factual apparent level of conversation, is it not almost safe to say that everything else is men talking about themselves? But don't get ahead of the story. Of course, if you don't get ahead of the story, you're not ever going to get anywhere. But that was my cliche for the night. Life needed men to specifically talk about themselves, but if there was not any passion involved, if whatever you said about yourself, and it doesn't matter whether it was pro or con at any given time, you would not talk about yourself, no one would, if there did not seem to be the promise of a sensational payoff. That is, that you had some sentiment about what you said about you. Why would you talk about you? What would you have to say? The point is nothing. And I could point out again the historical, in the backward sense of history, hero all the way from our view, the eastern side of this planet, from those societies, from those peoples, right up until today. All the way from, that is, old ideas of Shogun heroes up until Clint Eastwood and John Wayne, the guy that doesn't talk about himself. And of course, that one Clint Eastwood movie being the, whatever it was, kind of an ultimate of that genre of the guy that had no name and nobody knew anything about him. Is that not striking at what I'm talking about? But who would want to be around somebody like that? It seems attractive, especially to men, kind of in general, the kind of guy that doesn't talk. The kind of guy that just acts. The kind of guy, although you'd never heard that kind of term until you run across me talking this way, but a guy that doesn't talk about himself. He doesn't tell you what kind of guy he is. The kind of guy he is what he does. That won't do. It's archetypical in the dreams of the human nervous system, because everyone else, you're just talking about one or two guys, and they're fictional at that. I say one or two guys. We're talking about, we're talking about a part that Clint Eastwood played in the movie, that John Wayne played. And we're talking about fairy tales of these samurais. People have got to talk about themselves. But why would they do it if it did not seem to have a sensational payoff? That is, why would you talk about yourself unless it gave you pleasure or, it doesn't matter, made you suffer? If you get really good, what other kind of possible talking about yourself could you say? What could you say? What could you say? What could you say? See, I can't finish the sentence. All right, I will. What could you say about you that would not have some sentiment to you? I can give you a new, and somebody calling it law, how about a Wednesday night elusive implication? Because remember, even though I sometimes call them the law or some new law, they're really, it's not the way life works. Ordinary people, based upon them always having to start after a premise, they come up with scientific laws or psychological laws, spiritual laws. They're all implications, they're all suggestions, because they're all past the point of origin. They're flawed. You don't have the full information. But, be that as it fucking may, I was going to give you the Wednesday night law. And that is that only a real revolutionist, a real explorer, has ever thought about something without saying it. Which just about leaves everybody off the ship, doesn't it? Things are wired up in such a way, if I must point out the super duper obvious, that what is thought is said. Now, it doesn't matter whether you ever said it out loud. If you thought it, you said it. You said it to you. I'd like to punch it in the mouth. If you thought, I'd like to punch that bastard in the mouth, your uncle, your boss, your neighbor, if you said it, if you thought it, you said it. That's the way the nervous system is. That is the way life intends it to be. And of course there is a premise for me giving you the law for the Wednesday night. The premise is that it can be otherwise. And then I gave you a further premise that it could be otherwise for just a few people, certain kind of wiring system passing off as a human. And of course there's another premise that I'm suggesting that somebody that could do it, which is coeval causality again, anybody could do it would find it to be, oh, how about pleasurable squared? Beyond the realm of pleasure or suffering. But it would be only somebody who was outside, would be on the confines of the present development of the nervous system up here, not any particular way down here physically, or it's like, world wants to call it spiritual or emotionally or artistically, but up here, it would only be somebody beyond the complete grasp of that that has ever thought something and not said it. The premise being, the tacit premise being, me encouraging you that there is something there. Of course, I can let the bite out of the cat. How many times have I talked about, you don't tell yourself what you're doing? It's been a while since I mentioned, I used to call it trying to specifically consider, trying to neuralize, to remember something without thinking about it. Which of course will not fly at all in the linear world, if that's where you live. And if it is, no wonder you got that strange address. And that weird dress. And that strange look on your dress. Things are arranged in such a way that whatever a person thinks, which is their premise, is their life, will be said. That's what the dialogue is. Well, I'll go ahead without, because I've done it before, but I'm going to tell you there is a way. I tried to describe it as, even though words fail, to be able to remember something without thinking about it, which was how I defined neuralizing. But I can do it other ways. I can say, in case you thought that was holy or sacred, I could say, well, neuralizing, here's the real definition. It's to be able to think about something without remembering it. It just seemed that that was a little more viscid, for those of you who like that. It would just seem to be stickier, harder to think, wait a minute, how can you think about something without remembering it? Because it's bad enough to say, all right, you're realizing is this. Remember something without thinking about it. That makes your cat want to get back in the bag already. But to say, to think about something without remembering it. But it's all the same thing. What you're saying is that you are now no longer caught in the continual binary flow of this dialogue. That it's you talking to you, that it's goodness talking to you, it's potential suffering talking to you, it's unstated premises talking to you, it's stated premises talking to you. It still may be, to some of you, the most efficient ad hoc description is you can think something, which of course is not even the best way to say it, that your brain thinks of something. The energy flows into something. And let's say that you, apparently, it's the first thing you ever thought about in this particular way. That maybe you just been exposed at a party. Somebody just introduced you to so-and-so. Some old friend of yours said, this is my wife. You've never met her. We just got married. And you say a few words and just something. It comes in your brain that, damn, she's a bitch. Or if it was on the distaff side, boy, is he a bastard. It comes into your mind. Forget what reason, forget that she suddenly turned around and made some asinine or prejudicial comment. Maybe you don't even know. Something at a non-verbal level strikes you about this person, and the thought comes into your head, God damn, she's a bitch or a bastard. A few people, not for any moral, religious reasons, that can happen, and I described it this way before, is you can look off. Is what it amounts to. I grant you this, if I must. Your brain thought it. The thought ran into your brain. Everybody else, if they think it, they say it. It becomes part of the dialogue. And this includes, and there are people around in the ordinary world that would do this, that sometime after the fact would even either be discussing with somebody else or even with themselves, but usually with somebody else, that they'll go on some discussion about why you should be a better person, why you should try and be more religious or more humane, and the person may even say, you know what, that's true. Because even though I believe I'm getting better and I think I'm less prejudiced and I'm less hostile toward my fellow man, you remember that night at the party, so-and-so, and I met old Leopold was here, and I hadn't seen him in years, and he introduced me to a new wife, and I just talked to her a few minutes, and I'm not even sure what it was, whether she said something, and I suddenly thought that here she was, and him being an old friend of mine, and I was thinking, God damn, I don't like her. I even thought, well, you stupid bitch, shut up. I can always remember that I thought that. That kind of thing kind of brings you back down to earth, doesn't it? Kind of makes you humble, because I had no reason for it. I bet she's a fine person, at least. Part of the tacit premise in this conversation I'm making up would be that good people like you and I, whoever you're discussing it with, we shouldn't do such as that. Because we all got shortcomings. And I had nothing to base that on. I don't have enough information. But you understand that that is saying nothing. For the person to even deny that I had the privilege to do that, or I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what it was. Maybe I had too much to drink. Well, no, I wasn't drinking. Maybe I didn't feel good. Maybe she reminded me of somebody unconsciously. I bet she reminded me of somebody that hurt me. Or if you're even spookier, I'll bet that a person that looked like her, if not her, did me wrong in a past life. A few people, this noise does not become part of their dialogue. And of course I am strongly hinting that that sure is fun. And it's more than that, of course. It's along the lines, no matter how you describe it, of what got you intrigued or interested in such matters as this. It's not because of following the ordinary flows of the dialogue is right or wrong. And of course, there is no premise here possible for me to say, well, if you don't listen to what I'm telling you, if you go along and you keep saying everything you think, boy, you're going to get it. Because you're not going to get it. Boy, you're going to pay for that. No, you ain't. Or to say conversely, I won't do conversely, because then you'll think it's a real premise. There is no converse. Since it doesn't exist, how can there be a converse or a withal? That which is thought is meant to be said. We're back to, again, coeval causality. Thinking and talking are not separate. You can't talk unless you think, but thinking didn't cause talking. Talking caused thinking. If you believe one, you believe the other. It is not a linear progression from one to the other, but it is, for the sake of this kind of definition by usage tonight, the way I'm mapping it, that in the human nervous system that is thought. That life makes you think it. Your brain thought. Remember that one I gave you? Or your brother's brain. If you're really trying to get 11 feet away from it because of the shortage of those kind of poles, get away from it. My brother's brain thought that, and I picked it up in some way. The way things are wired up in ordinary life with ordinary people, that which is thought is intended to be said, or you wouldn't have thought it. And that includes people who then say it, if nothing else, to themselves, and then suffer over it. What I just tell you, all talk is sensational, or men wouldn't talk. Don't tell me you missed it. All thought is sentimental. All thought is sensational, or you wouldn't think it. Yeah, but I don't decide to think, it just seems to happen, and I decide to talk. Aha! Aha! What did I just tell you? Everything that's thought is intended to be said. Only a real revolutionist, whatever that is, only a real explorer, whatever that is also, has ever thought something and didn't say it. I don't guess there's any cause for me to intentionally be any more obtuse than some of this sounds, but I could conclude, which is obvious, it should be, it is to me that I'm about to do it anyway, to conclude this taping by asking the musical question, does that mean that perhaps the only real special information, what it is that people who might be interested in such as this are really looking for, is by its absolute very de facto definition by usage in a more complex way outside the three-dimensional world, though, that those things absolutely, forget cannot be said, simply are not said. Give cliches their due. Everybody's heard about swallowing your pride. What if a real revolutionist intellectually, a real explorer, can certainly take care of all the cliches needs of human existence, such as swallowing your pride, but could swallow everything else? Which, don't worry about fleas and elephants. That off on his or her own, for his or her own reasons, can have the brain beyond anyone's control, think something, and then swallow that bastard unnaturally and never say it. Not for any moral reason, not for any reason that I'm even going to try to tell you. Because any reason, if I was going to tell you, would be based upon the apparent sensational payoff of either pleasure or suffering on your part, not physically, but up here, that I enjoyed what I just thought, or I didn't enjoy it. What if you could just swallow it? For those of you seeing this on tape at some other time in some other place, since I sometimes say this in the beginning, I'll say it at the end tonight. What you have just heard has nothing whatsoever, because I'd admit it if it did. Be proud to do so. This has nothing to do with psychology, even less to do with religion. But you can't be less than nothing, I don't guess. Not here on this poor planet. Take talk as being premise-based. It's got nothing to do with talk if you take all talk as being definition other than by immediate usage. In other words, what you have heard has nothing to do with ordinary life. Well, let me condition that by saying,